What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and rumors are circulating out there that apparently Thanos is returning to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that Josh Brolin is, I guess, bringing back or coming back with Cable and Thanos. Now, honestly, these are just rumors, right? You guys know how this kind of thing starts, right? Like somebody out there mentions it, somebody out there mentions it, and specifically, this was a tweet that was sent out by Binge Watch This. So honestly, I haven't really been doing this game long enough to know whether or not Binge Watch This is like a reliable source of information, right? Or if they're like, we got this covered where just nobody believes them. I don't really know if that's the case or not. But as I saw that, it kind of got me thinking, right? Because I saw a whole bunch of responses to this tweet. And in all honesty, I'm in that school of thought, right? From people who were just kind of like, no, right? Thanos doesn't need to come back. Here's the thing. I love the character of Thanos in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? I love the way that he was done. In some ways, I think he was kind of an idiot, right? Like blinking out half the life in the universe, and then like in 1,000 years, we'd be right back to where we were before, so he just didn't really do anything meaningful, right? It was a stopgap measure. But at the end of the day, in terms of like his philosophies and like just his kind of just imposing presence and so on, I love the way that he was handled. But in my mind, the reality is that Thanos' story has been told. Right? Like Thanos is done. And as much as we love to see him return, I think what that does is it takes away from the opportunity to see better villains. Because here's one thing to keep in mind. In the grand scheme of what the Marvel Cinematic Universe could do, because I had somebody ask me this recently, right? Like, how long do you think these movies can go on for? The kind of, I guess, trend of making comic book movies, that will end before the Marvel Cinematic Universe runs out of content to make movies on, right? Like, I mean, just one thing to understand, this so for those of you guys who don't read comics, the first 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that's a 6-issue story arc in Marvel Comics, right? Or maybe an event, right? Maybe like a 12-issue event or something like that, right? You get all the origin one-shots, and then you basically get tie-ins for everything that's going on. And like the main event itself, which might be like 6 issues. That's it, right? I mean, there really isn't a whole lot doing there, right? So maybe more like 18 issues. But the important thing here is that's a very small number of issues. Just to give you guys perspective here, the Civil War event itself in Marvel Comics was like 110 issues long. And that was one event, right? So we're talking about the first 10 years just being a minuscule amount of time in relation to comic book storytelling. Now, extrapolate that out. Imagine all the events that have ever been covered in the history of Marvel Comics. Operation Galactic Storm, Maximum Security, the Onslaught Saga, Age of Apocalypse, the Kree Skrull War, like the Evolutionary War, all that kind of stuff. Like there's all kinds of things out there. And those events are sometimes colossal in scale, and sometimes they're relatively shorter. Then there's all the individual character story arcs. The Marvel Cinematic Universe can make content for hundreds of years. So the trend of interest in comic book movies will die out long before the MCU runs out of content to make. But the important thing here is there's a lot of ground that they could cover there. Would it be cool to see Thanos return? I guess. And I could see him returning in relation to like a flashback or maybe even in a TV series. Because one of the things that we didn't really get from like the whole Thanos, the whole Infinity Saga that I always wish we'd gotten was an origin story for Thanos. I mean, we kind of got one to a degree, right? Thanos like, well, you know, on my world on Titan, it was lush and nice. And then basically people just started procreating with reckless abandon and never gave any thought to the consequences of doing that, and then basically killed my world. So in order to prevent that from happening from across the cosmos, I'm just gonna blink out half the life of the universe, right? And that'll basically be it, right? He's like, you know, people on my world did what like humanity will have done in like 100 years, basically, you know? So, I mean, it's okay in terms of like an origin, but like an actual tried and true origin story, something akin to like Thanos Rising, right? Something akin to that story arc in movie or TV form. I always wish we'd seen that. But insofar as Thanos being like undusted, right? And then coming back, I don't really know how I feel about that, right? I feel like Thanos' story has been told. And so what I think our discussion really should be in the future of the MCU is what kind of villains do we want to see? Because here's one of the cool things to keep in mind, and we've talked about this before, or at least mentioned it, and it's something that I avidly believe. The villains are infinitely more interesting than the heroes, and they almost always have been, or at least in more recent years. I'd say since like the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, the villains have always been more interesting than the heroes. You can set your watch to a superhero, like there's a person in danger. Well, I'm gonna go put my life on the line to save that person. But the villains have motivation, they have drive. And so when you look at somebody like Thanos, sure, he's great, but the possibilities are endless here, and they don't all have to be on the same level as Thanos. Thanos is cool, and in the comics, he's a very imposing figure, and in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, having the Infinity Gauntlet really kind of etched him in as just a mainstay among all the villains in the MCU. And it's entirely possible that going into the future, he will always be at the top, right? He'll always be just the guy. I imagine most of that will be nostalgia because we grew up with the first 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so Thanos was like the big villain. So if for no other reason than the fact that we just kind of have these nostalgia feels, we'll always say like nobody will ever be better than Thanos. Like me, for example, I say no music's better than the music from the 90s. There's no arguing that, right? It's an absolute point. I mean, it's not really a debatable thing, but I also say that because I grew up in the 90s, so nostalgia. But the thing about this is that if you take away the power component, right, the idea of Thanos just being this really imposing and super powerful guy with the Infinity Gauntlet, and you look at just the nature of the villains themselves, Kang the Conqueror is cool, I guess, but like there's way more interesting villains out there. And we've talked about this guy before. William Stryker is just a ridiculously underappreciated villain across the board, leaving out the story arc in Marvel Comics where he blew up a bus of kids, which he did. It was pretty messed up. William Stryker is basically the leader of a group called the Purifiers, right? This guy is a fanatic. It's absolutely crazy. He's just a religious fundamentalist. This guy has no powers. He can't read minds. He cannot alter reality. He doesn't have telekinesis or anything like that. He's just a really charismatic guy who believed that it's his mission from God to kill mutants, because mutants are basically an abomination as far as he's concerned. The story, God Loves, Man Kills, right, where he was initially introduced by Chris Claremont back in the day, it opens up after the Purifiers have killed these kids' parents, and they're chasing these kids, and these kids end up in a playground, and when these kids are like begging for their lives, they're like, why are you doing this, right? Why are you killing us? And the Purifiers are like, because you don't deserve to live, and they kill them. And then they string them up with like a sign around their neck that says muties. It has obvious allegories to like racial issues from the 1960s, but like Magneto's the one that finds them and he goes on a warpath. But like the story doesn't end with some great big huge climactic battle like the end of Avengers Endgame or anything like that. It actually ends with a debate between Cyclops and William Stryker, where Cyclops basically corners him, right? And William Stryker keeps making this argument that no, you know, mutants are an abomination, they're against God's will and all that kind of stuff. And then ultimately, Cyclops is like, I mean, do you believe God's infallible? And the response of William Stryker is, of course, right? I'm a religious man. He's like, then you have to believe that if mutants exist, then it's God's plan. Therefore, we were created by God. And then William Stryker freaks out, pulls a gun, and then like he gets shot by a cop, right? And then like they haul him off to jail. But like when he comes back later, that's when it was really, really cool, right? He gets a hold of a futuristic robot, so he actually knows how things are going to unfold going into the future, and no one knows that he has this, so he just passes himself off as this guy with like knowledge of future events, different things like that. But like the original story was great. Now, I'm not saying that like a movie or a TV show needs to end in that capacity or even open up in the same way. But what I am saying here is that not all the best villains out there are trying to wipe out half the life in the universe. Not all the best villains out there are from like a different planet or hugely imposing or something like that. Sometimes they're just that damn dangerous, and that's what makes them cool. If we wanted to go a little more traditional MCU and focus on a villain who had powers, Superior Spider-Man is a great choice. Exactly how you build into that, I'm not entirely sure, but Dr. Octopus taking over the body of Peter Parker is a phenomenal story. In all honesty, I know a lot of you out there really love the idea of Thanos returning, and I totally understand. He was a great character, he had phenomenal 10 years, it was awesome just seeing him, right? Just the things he was able to pull off. But I feel like a lot of the desire to see Thanos return is really based more on the things you saw him do and the moments you experienced in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as opposed to the actual motivation and the character of Thanos himself. And so what I would invite you to do here is to experiment. And I might launch a series on this, to be honest, right? I may just make a series here on Geek Culture Explained and just call it Villains We Need in the MCU. And that's it, right? Just make videos on like the origins of villains and why I think we need them in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. What makes them cool and interesting? Because there's a lot of possibilities out there. If you guys want to see that, let me know down in the comments section, right? Let me know if that's something you guys would be interested, right? Because I got 25 years of comic book knowledge just rattling up here in the head, and that's just stuff I've read, right? You add in the stuff I've researched, and that's, well, it's a lot. It's quite a bit. But nonetheless, you know, just let me know what you guys think. I feel like it would be cool. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. And thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.